Dead Air Studios presents The Pain Chaser 1, Ambuscade, by Patrick E. Malloy, read for you by the author. This recording is released under a Creative Commons 4.0 license, so feel free to share it with your friends or enemies, but always give appropriate credit. This story is not intended for children and contains profanity, violence, and disturbing content that some people may find offensive. If you're in doubt, please turn back now, as you may find that some doors, once opened, refuse to be shut.
Rob had become separated from the others, eventually closing himself within a random classroom on the second floor. He paced the room in circles, his terror taking him over entirely and driving out any coherent thought. He paced because pacing was all he could think to do. He had just seen a man die. Not just die, but have his head cleaved open by something that looked like it belonged on the front of a heavy metal album. The man's name had been Phil. He'd shot the thing, and it didn't do shit. That monster had just picked him up and clawed off his face, slicing off the front of his skull like it was paper mache. Rob could see into the man's, Phil's, exposed brain. Rob suddenly gagged at the memory, but thankfully nothing came up. His hands and face were numb. He shook them to try to return the feeling, ran his fingers through his hair. That thing, that monster, could be coming for him next. It looked like a man, but it couldn't be. No man moved like that. No man was that strong. It was graceful in a frightening way. The creature's shape was deformed, almost grotesque. But the way it had moved had been so precise, so fluid, like its body had been crafted to move that way. Like it had been designed to hunt and kill. Rob put his hands over his eyes and pressed, trying to get a grip on himself. His face was wet with tears. He hadn't even been aware that he was crying. He didn't want to die in this place. He could try to get outside, but the snow out there was 1.5 feet deep, and he was miles from anyone who could help. If that thing followed him out into the snow, no, it would make more sense to stay hidden. He just needed to get straight. The sadness was in him worse than ever. It had horrible timing. This was like being in a nightmare you couldn't wake up from. Maybe the coke could help, just for now. He still had a decent amount left. If he could just get straight, he might be able to cope better. And coping meant surviving. It had definitely helped that morning when he and Annie had gone down into the basement. If he hadn't had it, he doubted he would have had the guts to explore that strange little room. He fumbled the little baggie out of his pocket with nerveless hands and untied it. He bent and shook a measure of the fine white powder onto the webbing between his forefinger and thumb, as was his habit. He sniffed it back quickly, throwing his head back and pinching his burning nostrils shut. As his watering eyes regained focus, he saw that there was a figure standing in the doorway watching him. It was Tabby. He froze like a deer in headlights. She'd been crying too. Tears streaked her face, leaving dark runs in her makeup, and her eyes were red and puffy. She looked at him with the curious look of a lost child. The coke was working him over, and before he could even think of what to say, she was walking over to him.
"Hi,"
she said, smiling weakly. "Hi," he said back, a feeling of unreality stealing over him.
"Can I have some?"
she asked, pointing at the baggie of coke still clutched in his hand. He nodded dumbly and handed her the little baggie. He watched as she poured some onto her outstretched fingers and snorted it. A wide grin broke over her face, and she rolled her eyes back exaggeratedly.
"God, it's been a long time since I had any of that. Thank you."
"No problem," he said, taking the baggie back from her. She smiled at him.
"Did I startle you just now?"
"A little," he admitted, returning her smile. But for once he was happy to have her there. Maybe it was mostly the coke going to work, but he already felt a little better.
"Rob,"
she asked,
"what is going on in this place?"
He shrugged. "I have no idea."
"That thing,"
she said, but she couldn't finish. "I know," he said simply.
"What it did to that cop. That just shouldn't even be possible."
The statement made the images of Phil come back in a rush, his head opening up like a piece of fruit, shuddering on the floor like a broken toy. "I'm really beginning to rethink what it is that I believe is possible," Rob said.
"Are you okay?"
she asked him, but he sensed that she was really asking it of herself. There were tears in the corners of her eyes again. "Yeah," he lied and smiled down at her. "Are you?" She shook her head, and then she had her arms around him, sobbing into his shoulder. This was a different side to Tabby than he'd ever seen. Her usual edge had been dulled. It was funny how easily fear could tear down somebody's defenses, though the drugs probably had something to do with it too. He hugged her to him, grateful for the comfort.
Do you think we're gonna get out of this alive?
She asked him. "Absolutely," he said, stroking her hair. "We just need to stick together from now on."
I don't want to die.
She sobbed. "I know."
I thought when Steve was killed that maybe it was an accident. That he fell out of a window or something. I thought maybe you just imagined the thing in the window, but that thing, that huge fucking thing, it killed him. Just like it did that cop. Tore him apart.
Rob's thoughts flitted back to those two pictures Anton had shown him on the internet. One man was torn entirely in two, with his viscera lying in a wet pile before him. The other had his jaw ripped free and his tongue hanging out. "I know," Rob said again. It seemed to be all he could manage.
Will you protect me, Rob?
She asked him, her voice muffled against his chest. He could feel the wetness of her tears soaking into his shirt. "Of course," he said. "We're going to get out of here alive." She looped her hands around his neck and was staring into his eyes. Then she was kissing him. It caught Rob by such surprise that he almost stumbled backward, but then he found that kissing her was exactly what he wanted to be doing at that moment. It was strange, but the coke and the need for comfort coupled to make him very horny. As her tongue explored his mouth, he felt himself growing hard against her. She seemed to have noticed too, as her hand was now trailing down the length of his cock through his jeans. He kissed her neck deeply, opening the buttons of her blouse so that he could free her breast. Her skin was tanned and dusted with freckles and trailed from the rim of her collarbone and down the swell of her perfectly round tits. He kneaded his hand between her breasts, squeezing the left globe tightly, and took her nipple in his mouth, flicking it lightly with his tongue and forcing a low moan to escape her.
Do you like them?
She asked, crooking her head down at him. "Yeah," he said, and actually laughed.
Paid enough for them.
She chuckled. She obviously had issues with her body. Otherwise, she never would have had the boob job, but in this time and place, the statement just sounded so queer. Here Rob was, hiding out from some bloodthirsty 7-foot-tall monster, and he was groping a woman he usually couldn't stand.
What?
She asked. "Nothing," he said. "I guess I just realized how weird this all is. I mean, I never would have thought of you and me together. We're not even friends."
Do you want to stop?
She asked. "Not at all," he said.
Rob, do you want to fuck me?
She asked him, pressing her lips close to his ear, and running her hand down his pants and along the length of his bare shaft. He did, and he told her so. Annie was tired of running. She'd been either running or hiding since early that morning. Now, she was alone, scared, and her stomach hurt. But if she stopped, that awful thing would catch her. It had been chasing her since it killed that cop on the second floor. One glance over her shoulder told her that it was still pursuing her. Worse, it was now carrying the fire axe taken from the scene of the dead man's body. The strange thing was, she'd seen the way it moved when it had killed that man. There was no doubt in her mind that it could outrun her if it wanted to. She felt confident that it was actually playing with her. But that was a theory she could not bring herself to actually test. It moved with a strange plodding motion that was almost playful. It reminded her of her kid brother chasing the dog around the dining room table. It seemed to regard her as a toy. Once she tripped and fallen, leaving one of her shoes behind, and the creature had actually slowed, seemingly giving her time to regain her footing. In a show of agitation and disgust, she'd thrown her remaining shoe at it, which it actually caught nimbly and studied curiously before discarding. She'd played with the idea of actually stopping and facing the beast, just to see what it would do. Likely, the creature would know the game has ended, and having no further use for her, discard her as quickly as the shoe. She hadn't seen any sign of the others in what seemed like ages. Logic told her that they were probably hiding inside one of the many empty classrooms. Up ahead was the body of Officer Phil Dodson. She closed her eyes tightly as she passed it, not wanting to see that horror again. This also meant that it was the third or fourth time that she'd come this way. She decided that as unlikely as it was that she would find help at this point, it was doing her no good to stay here on the second floor. There was a stairwell at the next turn. She would take it down to the first floor and then continue to run. What other choice did she have? To give up meant almost certain death. She palmed the door as she passed through it, sustaining a run that almost made her fall as she came to the stairwell. The slap of her bare feet echoed loudly off the walls of the claustrophobic antechamber as she made her way down the stairs. She risked a glance up and was surprised to see that the monster was not following, but stood bent over the guardrail, looking down at her. When she neared the bottom, it leaped over the railing. It meant to drop right on top of her as she reached the ground floor. It definitely saw this as a game. There was no longer any doubt. She threw on an extra burst of speed, vaulting the last 4 steps and pushing her worn-out body to the absolute limit. The extra effort was well worth it as she passed right under the thing. It landed cat-like 5 feet behind her, but she paid dearly for the maneuver. As she shouldered through the door at the stairwell's bottom, trying to keep her balance, her ankle twisted painfully. Every step she took was now punctuated by a flash of white-hot pain. Her mouth was dry, and her lungs burned with every breath that she took. But she willed herself to keep going. If this nightmare was going to kill her, she was determined to give it hell doing so. The unburdened, deliberate pace of the pursuing creature mocked her. Her fear of it was slowly twisting with hatred. The hatred that would like to see it more than defeated, but humiliated and torn apart like the 2 men it had already killed. Had the power been within her at that moment, she would surely have turned the creature's sadistic nature on itself. Every corridor she navigated, she was sure would be her last, but still, she pressed on. She ran and she ran, past the lounge which served as their safe haven as they hid from the creature that morning, and the office where she placed the phone call to Henry last night. She wondered if it would be the last time she would hear his voice. The thought gave her an extra ounce of strength she hadn't believed was in her. Ahead and to the left were a set of double doors which led to the gymnasium. She made a snap decision and hung a quick left, throwing wide the doors and limping into the vast arena. 2 men were coming toward her from the opposite side of the gym. Her heart gave a huge leap. It was Anton and Officer David Archer.
It's coming!
She yelled at them as she limped painfully toward them, hopping now with every step. Her foot felt numb beneath her. Soon she would fall and it would all be over. "Get down, Annie!" Dave yelled. He was pointing his gun right at her. Instinctively, she dropped to the floor. He shot twice, and she saw with horror that the monster was only steps behind her. The bullets let out a whip crack that she felt in her ears, temporarily flooding the auricular world with a high-pitched whine. But the creature wasn't even slowed. The shots tore through the flesh of its chest and thigh, splattering the gym floor with dark red ichor, but the beast was impervious to pain. She scrambled to her feet, but the wasted moment had cost her the chase. One claw-tip hand bit into her between the shoulder blades, tearing deeply into the skin. The force of the blow was so strong that it propelled her forward. Her face bounced off the gym floor, breaking her nose and shattering her front teeth. With an indomitable effort, she flipped onto her back just in time to see the axe come down. She brought her hands up in a useless attempt to protect her face, and she felt the axe bite painfully into the underside of her arm, just before her armpit. She heard Dave yell, "Don't fucking touch her!" and a third shot rang out. She watched as the creature's left eye socket exploded in a shower of blood and pulverized glass. Finally, something seemed to give it pause. Her last thought was a mental smile before exhaustion, pain, and blood loss finally took her consciousness. "Take that, you bastard." Annie woke up in a daze. Her head throbbed like she was recovering from a bad hangover, and her stomach ached severely. The room around her swam into focus slowly. Anton knelt next to her, and she could see the tall, thin form of Dave Archer standing by the doorway, no longer wearing his uniform shirt. He had stripped down to a sweat-soaked wife-beater that was splattered with drying blood. She's waking up, Anton said excitedly. She tried to sit up and her vision swam. Her left arm would not support her. She couldn't even feel her fingers. Then she remembered the axe. Careful there, Dave said, walking over to them. You lost a lot of blood. You're badly dehydrated.
What happened to you?
She asked him in a voice like dry leaves. He looked down at his blood-stained shirt. The blood is yours, Anton told her. After the vessel attacked you, Dave carried you back here from the gym. She could see now that they were in the main office. More of it was coming back to her. That thing, the vessel, had chased her relentlessly through the school. It had tormented her like a child might torment an insect. It had torn into her, broken her teeth, and attacked her with an axe. She could see now that Dave had torn his shirt to bind her wound and make a tourniquet. Her left hand looked odd, waxy and pale. She tried to flex the fingers. They shuddered weakly in response.
Where is it now? The vessel.
We don't know, Anton said, glancing at Dave. It ran off after Dave shot it. He yelled at it to leave you alone, and it did. It was the damnedest thing. I don't think it liked being shot in the eye very much. She chewed at something hard and granular in her mouth, realizing with horror that they must be chips of her broken teeth. She traced the sharp, jagged line of them with her tongue and felt a fresh wave of hatred for the thing that stalked them. How do you feel? Anton asked with obvious concern in his eyes. She felt the anger she didn't even know was there subsiding. Anger for leaving her alone to face that monster, the vessel. What she saw now was the face of a scared child. She couldn't be mad at him for running, for trying to survive. She smiled up at him.
Like I got hit by a truck,
she said. She let her head sink back to the concrete floor. You should really drink something, Anton said. We don't have any cups or anything, unfortunately, but there's a water faucet right over here. I can help you get over to it. She nodded and slung her good arm around his neck. He lifted her to her feet and she hobbled to the little kitchenette, dipping her aching head in the sink. She turned the water on and took a couple of huge mouthfuls. Her stomach and throat screamed in protest, but her body needed it. After the third swallow, her stomach relaxed and received the water gratefully. She let the cool liquid run down the sides of her face and into her hair. Better? He asked.
Better,
she said, wiping water from her face. Can you stand on your own? Dave asked her. Give her a minute, man. She just got mauled by a friggin' monster, Anton said. Yeah, I realize that, and I don't mean to be insensitive, but like I said before, if that thing finds us hiding in here, we're sitting ducks. If we absolutely have to run again, one of us will have to carry her. Anton nodded his agreement and turned back to Annie. Can you stand? He asked her with a touch of apology.
I think so,
she said, testing her weight on her bad foot and wincing at the pain. Here, Dave said, holding the axe out for Annie to take. You can lean on this like a crutch. The monster dropped it when it ran away. She looked at the axe with revulsion. She could still see her own blood drying on its blade. She took it apprehensively and found that it did help. Before we go, I wanted to talk to you about something, though, Anton said, holding up the book. She shook her head, showing that she didn't understand. I've been reading some more while you were unconscious, and I think I may have figured out what's going on here. Some of it, at least. He looked at Dave as if to ask permission to tell Annie his theory. Dave nodded, and he continued. This is going to sound really strange. She actually laughed.
We're in a school that seems to be moving backward in time, and I was almost just killed by Stretch Armstrong's crazy axe-murdering brother. I don't think anything you have to say is going to sound strange to me anymore.
Okay, he said, thumbing through the book. It says here that Ei Sotak, the god that lives in that pyramid thing that you found, feeds on pain and insanity. Her eyes went wide in horror.
Oh my god, I totally forgot. The claustrum, where is it?
It's okay, Anton said, pointing to Dave, who held up the sheet-wrapped pyramid. We still have it. We found it when you passed out.
Good,
she said with a look of relief.
I don't think we should let the vessel get his hands on that thing.
I totally agree with you. I was going to get to that. Anton took a deep breath before speaking again. He obviously thought there was weight to what he was going to say next. The book says that in order for Ei Sotek to feed, he influences those around him, amplifying those things about themselves that cause them pain, their worst qualities. It exposes the things we hide and gives them teeth. There are stories in the book about people who have gone completely insane because they become obsessed with these things. One guy cut off his eyelids because he was so terrified of his own nightmares. He showed her the page of the book that he was currently open to. It showed a man, eyes wide and staring with a maddening smile on his deeply lined face. My point is, the Isotac is some kind of spirit that feeds on our fear and pain, but it's not just the living. It also feeds off of other spirits. If I'm right, it might be that what we're seeing happen to this school is a byproduct of that. This place was a tomb for close to 50 men, women, and children. We woke it up when we opened that door in the basement. But what if we woke them up too? What if the Isotac is causing their fear of this place to manifest physically, turning it back into the thing that they remember, the place where they all died? She was staring at him. I know, it sounds nuts, he shrugged.
No.
She shook her head.
No, I think you might be right. When I'm near that colostrum thing, it makes me feel odd, anxious, like I can't control my thoughts. Okay, let's assume you're right for the moment,
she hypothesized.
If we don't get out of here, the same thing will happen to us, right? We lose our minds too? Killed by our worst fears or something?
I don't think it works that way, Anton said. It doesn't want us dead. It wants us afraid or in pain. Its influence doesn't kill, it changes, molding first the mind and eventually the body. It takes the things about you that you can't face and tortures you with them.
Then why is the vessel trying to kill us?
She asked. That's the thing. Anton ran his fingers through his hair nervously. I don't think the vessel is an agent of the Isotac. I think it's a victim. What if it's the killer? The one who started the fire in the 60s? Turned into some kind of mindless beast by Isotac's influence? She nodded.
That makes sense. If he were already a little unhinged, it wouldn't take much to push him completely over the edge. Something that feeds off of pain and insanity would love that. A depraved creature that's driven to kill recklessly and is tortured by the guilt of every one of its victims.
Yes, Anton agreed. But there's more to it. The book also says the Isotac desires to have a physical body, and only the vessel can give him that. A tortured spirit, forged by fire that kills without remorse. The colostrum isn't exactly a prison. The runes all over it were put there to seal Isotac's power, but they were put there by the cult. He has some control over his power, but most of it just leaks out of him. If he's united with the vessel...
He would be free?
She asked.
More powerful than he is now?
Anton looked at her thoughtfully. The last chapter of the book talks about the rise of Isotac. It promises eternal life to those who follow Isotac and give themselves to him willingly. It's a doomsday scenario.
Like the end of the world?
She asked him. Worse, he said. Hell on earth. If Isotac gets a body, he will reshape the world to be a paradise for his followers, but for everyone else? Tabby couldn't tell if it was the cocaine in her system or an adrenaline response to the constant fear that she'd been dealing with, but she'd never been so horny in her life. Rob lay on his back, naked, holding onto her shoulders as she rode him like it was their last night on Earth. A foot away, their combined clothes sat in a messy pile, forgotten, and in the shadows of the doorway leading to the room, the creature watched with its one remaining eye. Rob rolled Tabby onto her back and entered her with a long, deep thrust that forced a gentle moan from her lips. She locked her legs around his waist, and he leaned over her as he began to fuck her harder. It was because of this position that Rob never saw the enormous shadow that rose up silently like a wraith behind him. Tabby saw it, however, and her face went from a look of ecstasy to one of horror. She tried to scream, but the sound caught in her throat. Her muscles tensed reflexively. Rob could feel her body tighten both inside and out, and in the second before the monster struck, he knew something was wrong, but he never had time to react. One great claw plunged like a piston into the exposed skin of Rob's lower back. It tore through skin, muscle, and sinew, pulverizing his spinal column and instantly paralyzing him from the waist down. He cried out in shock and pain, collapsing against Tabby as the muscles below his waist lost communication with his brain. Tabby found her voice, letting out a piercing scream that quickly deteriorated into a mad gabble as she tried to pull herself out from underneath Rob's weight. The creature grabbed the back of Rob's hair and pulled back, craning his neck awkwardly, while putting its enormous knee against Rob's ass and adding its own substantial weight, pinning Rob both on top of and inside of Tabby. She clawed at the floor frantically, trying to pull herself away. Rob strained to look down at her, pleading wordlessly. His mouth opened and closed like a fish. "Help me," he whimpered, finally finding his voice. His eyes rolled horribly as the creature tore into his flesh again. She could feel his blood run down onto her, still warm with life. It pooled between her legs and made the floor slippery. The creature shifted its weight for another swipe, pulling back on Rob's head as it did, giving Tabby an instant to catch her breath and scuttle back a couple of inches. She felt Rob's bloodless, flaccid penis slide out of her, and then the weight was back, pinning and crushing her. The creature tore relentlessly at Rob, seemingly oblivious to the woman it pinned beneath him. Little by little, she worked herself free. Her mind was consumed now by panic, forced to decamp in a desperate need to protect her sanity, except for the primal animalistic need to escape. With each frantic moment, she wormed herself a little further out from underneath the writhing bulk. Above her, Rob's mouth lolled open like an exhausted dog, leaking a blood-speckled trail of drool down on her naked body. Then suddenly, and without warning, the creature reeled back, taking Rob unwillingly with it. Tabby sat bolt upright and pushed herself to her knees with her hands, almost slipping in the blood beneath her. Miraculously, she was free. Without a second glance at her would-be lover or a thought to humility, she bolted like a deer, climbing to her feet and running naked out the open door and into the hall beyond. Rob, meanwhile, was sent sprawling onto his back. The cold concrete stung against his open and raw flesh. "What the fuck are you?" he screamed up at the creature bearing down on him. "Why are you doing this?" It came forward then. Rob tried to pull himself away with awkward rowing motions, dragging his useless legs behind him. His hands slipped, slick with his own blood, and his head collided painfully with the concrete, causing him to black out for an instant. He was shocked back awake as fresh pain exploded from his hand and lanced up his arm. The creature had brought down one booted foot on his hand, and it was using it to fasten him to the floor, grinding his knuckles into splintered shards of bone. Rob watched, as if in slow motion, as the other foot came up like a rearing snake. "No! No!" he protested. "Stop! What do you want?" He tried to pull away, but the immobilized, ruined hand secured him in place. Then, with a kick that could have leveled a solid slab of granite, the creature's foot connected with Rob's face and caved in his head. If you're listening to this on YouTube, please like and subscribe. And if you like what you've heard so far, please consider supporting my Patreon. I try to do this for free, but I do have to support myself somehow. Also, physical copies of my books are available